Rebecca and Jamie, it is such a pleasure and an honor to have you on the Yoke and Abundance podcast. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
The two of you have just released a book, Radical Humility, Essays on Ordinary Acts. And I am holding it here. I'm so excited about this book. And before we launch into that, I would love for each of you to share a little bit about who you are and what is keeping you full of purpose these days. Jamie, can we start with you?
Sure. So I'm Jamie Vander. I'm an art librarian at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And like a lot of people, I think that my family is keeping me full of purpose right now. I think with everything that's happened in the last year, sort of refocused a lot of people's priorities. So while work is really important to me and I get a lot of joy and I feel very lucky to do the job that I do, I spend so much more time with my family than I used to, and I'm really grateful for that. And watching I have a 5-year-old, watching her grow into a person and kind of like being part of shaping that is a bigger part of my life than it was before everything changed a little over a year ago. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Rebecca, how about you?
Hi, I'm Rebekah Modrak, and I'm a faculty member in the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. I'm an artist, and I would say that I think a lot in the last few years, but especially now, about some inequities that I see, both within the university, within my community nationally, and sort of like expressions of power that are being used sort of forcefully and maybe without concern for others. And that gives me a lot of purpose, trying to figure out how to resist that, or at least to expose it in some ways.
Thank you so much. All right, now I have to know, where did the seed of an idea come from for this book? How did it come into being?
So I would say maybe my 15th year of teaching here at the University of Michigan. And the culture, I started to notice some changes in the culture. There was more emphasis on presentation of self, of sort of the, things that maybe like are less substantive, but more status-based, like caring more about like the title of your talk at a conference rather than what you had learned through the talk itself or the research that you had done leading up to the talk. We were having boaster meetings suddenly where we were encouraged to get together with like another school and faculty from that school, and we would each have a minute to describe how important we were. And I was being told by some administrators, like, I mean, we all were, how are you visible? And so there was this increasing emphasis on visibility, and not on like substance or meaning of our work or the value of our work, the content of our work, but on, like how we were sort of promoting ourselves and our work. And that was of concern to me. It was a big shift from where I think we were before, where the emphasis was really on content and discovery. And at the same time, I sort of saw some failures, extreme failures at the university in terms of like process and bias. And when I tried to report those, there just were doors shut like constantly. Nobody wanted to hear about these problems. They really just wanted them to go away. And so I was thinking about that. I was sort of disappointed in the culture of the university. And I was also, Donald Trump had started running for presidency. And so I was, aware of like all the boasting and a lot of the language that was starting to amp up in national politics. And I accepted an art residency in Nebraska at the time. And so my family drove out there together for a month. to spend the month so I could interview people who work with their hands, manual laborers, and especially farmers. And when we were in Nebraska, it was just an amazing culture shift in so many ways from Ann Arbor. And it was much more similar to what I had experienced growing up in Pittsburgh. People didn't like lead with like how important they were or with the status. They really like deferred. I mean, you wouldn't have learned anything about a person in those ways talking with them. You only sort of learned that about them from somebody else who, after the person had left, kind of popped their head in and said, by the way, that person's the mayor, or by the way, that person's our state senator. But I was also seeing this just in terms of like how people lived. So, in Ann Arbor, like kids show up for camp with their $70 backpacks, and you go into the grocery store nearby, and there's just like a lot of like excess, I would say, in terms of like specialty products, like so much sort of emphasis on like what you can buy, and like one restaurant in Ann Arbor has like hand-torn croutons, which we sort of joke about, like, aren't all croutons hand-torn? I don't know. But so in Nebraska, there wasn't, in the small town we were in, there wasn't this emphasis at all. Like, you went into the grocery store and there was one kind of grape, and there was three kinds of crackers. And it's not what you sort of spent your time thinking about. And so as I was interviewing farmers, they kept, they kept saying to me, you should interview this one farmer in particular. And I asked, like, well, what's special about this farmer? Like, what does he know about, agriculture? And they said, well, he's really humble. And I was so taken aback by that word. It wasn't a word I had heard very often. But it really reflected the culture I was seeing in Nebraska, and also that I was really enjoying experiencing. And I thought, I want to like know more about humility, and I'm so curious to talk with people who think about humility. So I reached out to Jamie, and to a philosopher at the university, and to a marketing professor who studies pride at the university. And the four of us got together to start thinking about humility.
Jamie, what intrigued you? Why did you say yes to being a part of this project?
Well, I was pretty new in my job at the time. I had gone from being a librarian that mostly worked with sort of like entry level beginning students who are undergrads, they could be majoring in anything, to focusing on the people that Rebekah, the community that she's part of, the Stamp School of Art and Design. So that was sort of like learning what it meant to work with art professionals. And so simultaneously, I was also a brand new parent. I had my daughter, so this was like about 5 years ago. So my daughter was young and had just entered daycare. And when I signed her up for daycare, they sent me this form I needed to fill out, where I like kind of described how I wanted everything to go for her every day when she was there. So like when she napped and what her preferences were and things like that. And at the time that she entered daycare, she was like 3 months old. So she preferences is kind of like a stretch. I mean, she was clear about her opinions, I guess you could say, but like, it seemed surprising to me that like I was supposed to dictate how one small person among like, I don't know, maybe 20 babies, how are they going to manage like the individual precise preferences of 20 babies in this 2-room space? So I started to kind of be concerned about like the trajectory that I was setting her on with like putting her out into the world where people are so concerned with like everyone having their own perfect individualized situation. I feel like we kind of socializing people to behave that way in our culture. And I started to worry like, well, when will she learn about her community and like how she fits into that? And how she can be, how she can kind of adjust her own expectations and behavior to be part of something bigger. Like it seemed like a bad sign that she was heading off in a different direction at 3 months. So I wasn't really like that conscious of those thoughts. It's not like I was like, thinking about it a lot, but it was kind of in the back of my mind. So when Rebekah approached me, certainly it was like not something that I was expecting to be thinking about when it comes to like working with artists and designers, both students and faculty. But at the same time, I realized that like I had actually been thinking, I guess kind of like Rebekah, a lot about it. Like it just was like there. And I think that now that we have this book coming out, we encounter almost everyone we encounter is in a similar place, or like it's not like they think about humility and name it, but it's like, oh, like I am witnessing the opposite of it a lot. And I have some reactions or thoughts to that. And so maybe I also want to think about this or talk about this. So like my own feelings at the time that she approached me were maybe sort of similar to when people encounter the book now.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I have to say, Rebekah, when I was reading your essay and a lot of what you just outlined for us, the talking about the boasting sessions, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a bootstrapping entrepreneur, which means that there is a lot of trying to put yourself out there, and I'm an introvert, and like I have to put myself out there, so I do it, and I don't love it, and I've been trying for the past like 5 or 6 years to land a TEDx talk, right? And one of the things that really disgusts me about the application is that before they even ask you what your idea is, they want to know what social media platforms you're on so that they can go check the numbers and how engaged your audience is. And that's all I could think of when I was reading and yes, I still want to land a TEDx talk, but I'm slightly disgusted. It's because it isn't just about the idea you have or how well you can teach or convey that idea. It's about, do you have an audience? Have you developed that? How well can you boast about yourself in the process? And so I could really relate to what you had written about in that, because there's so many opportunities as a new entrepreneur where people don't want anything to do with you until you've had your name in the paper or a public magazine, or, so it's a weird chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah, and that seems really contradictory, right? Because TEDx has the opportunity to really, make sure people know about voices that aren't being heard. And so, if they're only part of this cycle that's perpetuating, and rebroadcasting the voices that are already, have a big audience, that seems a waste of their platform. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. But they want to know that you're going to be able to help promote those TEDx talks.
It was really similar when we started. Well, we had this colloquium, which was like an invited conference basically with a small group of people. But, how can you have all these ideas and then not figure out how to share them more broadly? And then they also were ideas that like, I think would be interesting to anyone. They weren't like very specific to a certain discipline or something. But when we started trying to figure out how to put it out into the world, we encountered a really similar situation, like very similar resistance, the same kind of like, how will we partner with this project? And then like that project is going to have social media that will then, kind of like amplify it, versus like, is it a good idea? The people need to hear, think, or talk about this. This is like definitely not the first question. The first question is, do you already have a developed audience? Like, how can you demonstrate that? Which, when you first think about it, that's not necessarily a bad question, I guess. Like, it makes sense to me that there's limited ability to promote anything, or people are sort of paying attention to what they're paying attention to. But if you really start to think about the impact of always making all of your decisions like that, you can really see how it's like this like echo chamber of like sameness.
That's exactly the word that was in my head. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be suggested to us that we get more celebrities on board to talk about humility, which was really funny. And, for us, the value of the book and the stories that we were hearing were that they were coming from very real lived lives. So, Kevin M., who was working at a tech startup and got laid off from his job, sent out 150 applications, was sitting in a coffee shop one day working on his CV, depressed about not having found a job, and walked across the street to a restaurant and handed in his CV to them and got hired on the spot, like working, lowest rung in the kitchen, like prepping food for the cooks, and ended up like loving his job so much because, as he describes in the essay, everyone is really direct in the kitchen. Like nobody, you don't have to go through 3 committees like you do in the tech world to come up with an opinion about something. Like someone walks over to you and says, you're cutting that onion wrong. And he described like what it was like to get a lot of advice right away, because there was so much he needed to learn, and sort of the openness he needed to have for that advice, and at the same time, like the community that came with this sort of like honesty, and with a group that was so willing to be open with each other, and how valuable that community was.
That leads me to another question. What were some of your favorite essays that you included in the book?
Well, there's so many of them. I mean, certainly I find myself returning to some of them again and again in my thoughts. So Valerie Tiberius and Melissa Koenig, they covered how humility can help you be a better friend. So, every person has friends and family. So it's something that's quite applicable to any human, basically, of any age, really. So I think about that essay a lot, because it kind of lays out how we can shift our mindset to be more like centering others as opposed to centering our own ideas about how things should go, which is something that I think is, as pointed out in other essays, it's really hard to do.
I loved in that one where she said "you" before me when she was sharing the food. I think it was that essay.
That's actually Ruth Nicole Brown. But yeah, that's a wonderful thing. It's like you get tattoos that say that or something, like that's a great way of encapsulating the mindset.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
Oh, no. Yeah, I love that too. That's another really fabulous essay, I think, because, it's sort of poetically touches on the impact that a person who demonstrates that kind of mindset can have on, others around them. Yeah.
How about you, Rebekah?
Well, the one that I read too pretty frequently. I mean, we spent 3 years editing this book, and I still, once it was published last month, I have read it twice all over again. I know that's
amazing. That's really amazing, because you're like, Rebekah is the one who's read every essay the most times to begin with.
They just ground me in a way. So I read Jen Wrights, who's a psychologist, and I love some of the ways that she describes decentering yourself. Like she talks about this gravitational pull that we all feel, where our own needs and our own beliefs are, of course, centered for us because we're aware of them all of the time, but that that how important it is to decenter ourselves, to become aware of other people's gravitational pulls. And she talks about humility as a state of being. So it's something you can travel into and out of. And, that I might be in one moment, like kind of more aware of my own pull. But in another moment, I might be more aware of others, and, that it's a flux. So that helps me a lot to kind of remind myself of that inconsistency in a sense, and that's a natural path of this process. But she also describes a lot of the sort of attributes that people have, as they're growing up, that help to foster some of these qualities. So like being raised in a nurturing environment where you feel connected allows us to, be more able to recognize other people's centers or gravitational pulls or the limits of our own. But she also I love that she talks about, having experiences where we, for example, encounter like the death of a loved one things that we have no control over. And in recognizing that there are some things we're powerless, to change, she said that's really important in developing the sense of humility, because I think it's similar to what I experienced with the farmers, that, when the tornado comes through and just destroys your entire crop, I mean, you can sort of sit there and be bitter about it, or you can, you can sort of be angry at the tornado, I suppose, or you can, accept it as something beyond your control, and kind of start to move on from that, because you realize that, there are things that are bigger than you. And I think right now during the pandemic, especially, that's really important to recognize that, so many things we just don't have control over. It's a boat that's, in a way, the navigational system is broken. And once you kind of have accepted that, then you deal with like what that means, rather than kind of fighting that problem the whole way. So she talks about how important it is to, admit to other people you don't know things, especially to children. So Jen writes is very important and helpful for me. And then the other one that I go to a lot is Rick Boothman's, was a lawyer who spent 20 years defending hospitals from medical malpractice. And then one day realized he was kind of doing a disservice to the profession, and went home and said to his wife, I need to change. I from now on, I'm going to, he's accepted a new job as the head legal officer for a hospital. And he said, we're going to start apologizing for medical mistakes. So this essay, I read it, I have read it so many times. I cry every time I read it. And it's so cathartic for me to see that somebody in a position of authority was able to make a change like that in their life, and also was able to lead other people in making really like an ethical change, for the better of the entire community.
Servant leadership at its finest. Yeah, that's incredible. You touched on something with the first essay that you talked about, that like when things happen outside of your control, like a death, for example. Like my father passed away in 2019. It was my first experience with, I had grandparents pass away that I loved, but it was my first experience of like a really pivotal human in your life passing away. And I didn't think about it until you just said it, how that is an exercise in humility, because there's typically an outpouring of love and support that happens, but also just the act of it happening before you realize like you are so small in the grand scheme of things. It really puts things in perspective in a way that don't, and it's not something I wish on anybody, but most of us will experience it, right? Like if we live a long, healthy life, and it is a humbling experience for sure.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss. Yeah, that must have been really difficult. And I agree. I mean, the other person that I really, this isn't in our book, but Viktor Frankl has been really an important writer to me, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And and he writes about, so he lost his wife, who was killed in a camp in World War II, a concentration camp. And he writes a lot about needing to kind of like remember that their relationship and his connection with her is sort of greater than her, like her existing there with him. And he writes about what that was like for him. Like they were separated in the camps, and he, was thinking about her. And at that moment she, had died, and he hadn't known it. But he writes about, just in that moment of having like this thought of her, like that was love, and that was connection, and how important that was.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I loved both of your essays in the book, I have to say. And Jamie, I was revisiting yours this morning, and you write about comparing libraries to museums. I never would have thought to do that. Can you share a little bit about your essay and why you wanted to share it in the book?
Sure. I mean, I guess sort of to get back to like when you asked us to introduce ourselves and how we kind of came into things, like or how we came into the project, like librarians are very used to helping other people with their work. So it's like how I've been trained. It's like librarianship is the path that I started on when I finished school. So it's like kind of, I'm like very institutionalized. But like, you know, I think it's like this, so the ethos is like you are, you learn a lot about how information is structured, and then one person at a time, you listen to them almost like a therapist kind of, to try to figure out what they want and what they're trying to do. And then you take your knowledge and try to help them figure out, you know, kind of help them figure out how they can move forward with their project. But very rarely are you doing your own project, you know, unless it's like, you know, in an academic context, we're expected to do our own projects, but they're usually sort of like interrogating like the systems that we work with and things like that. So when I joined this project, I was like unsure how I could contribute an essay. Like it made sense to me to think about like all the different people we could invite and all the different like aspects of like the back end of things, but I had no idea what I could contribute because I was used to helping everyone else think about what they were going to contribute to things. But I started to think a little bit more about, you know, that, I guess. And I had initially, when I was younger, I had wanted to work in an art museum. So I also had experience working in art museums and like the difference between museums and libraries in general. And I think it's like sort of unrecognized how much libraries are about the people that they serve. You know, I think that people think about libraries as just being about books or sometimes literacy. You know, people will kind of like, I think if you ask someone to like word associate, those are maybe the two words that you would get. But I think that, and I say this in my essay, that libraries are really about sharing, you know, and so I think that like they sort of become mirrors of their communities, and if they are good libraries, I think. And one thing that is really like, I think especially special about libraries is that they are about every single person who might possibly use them. Like each person gets to decide how the library works for them, which is like so the opposite of your experience when you go to a museum. You know, like if you go to like a blockbuster show, like you're gonna line up as if you're going to the airport and then you file through and see only the things that were selected for your view. But even in like a small museum, you know, they always have more things than they are able to display. And, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but I think it just sort of highlights how libraries adopt a very different approach.
I loved it, and I have to say, I'm sure you're getting this feedback a lot. Your essay unlocked memories for me that are really special, and it unlocked the memories of, as a kid, we were in walking distance to the library, and we would walk to the library at least once a week, and we could, my mom said we could, as many books as we could carry, you know, it was okay to bring home. And those books that you would read over and over, even though you knew you were sharing them, they began to feel like yours.
Mhm.
And sometimes you'd get the same books out over and over, and sometimes you'd get other ones. But I don't know that, I mean, as a child, I think my library card was probably my most prized possession. And that library card was my ticket to any adventure I wanted.
Mhm.
And so it was, you know, you just really unlocked a lot of beautiful memories for me. And I love your point that the library is about sharing and that open source. So that was a beautiful addition to the book. I'm glad that you did not stay a support role.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting to me in presenting my work at the colloquium because I had thought everyone would be super bored. Because sometimes there are things that interest me that are less interesting. Like I'll test them out on my husband and he will be a little less interested in the way information is organized than I am. But in reading my essay, like an earlier version of it aloud, I could see everyone sort of having similar experiences to what you just described. They're thinking about their own experiences with libraries, or times when they have experienced that they could choose whatever they like, and that's so powerful. And like, when does that happen to you? I remember when I first moved to Ann Arbor, I worked at the public library then, and there was like this very big bookstore. It was a Borders, which doesn't exist anymore. And in some ways there were like similar populations that would spend a lot of time like in the hanging out in either of those locations. And I think one of the coolest things about the library is that you don't have to, there's no transactional sort of like organizational setup. Like, you don't have to buy anything. It's one of the only places where, yes, any you, like, you have as much right to that institution as any other human. And I think that's so cool. Like, where else do you go in your life where that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a beautiful piece of it. And I remember like particular librarians, like I had favorite librarians who I knew if there was something I wanted, they would be eager to help me, and they would go above and beyond. And that, I don't know, you just brought back so many incredible memories. And I just have to shout out to Toledo's public library system, because it was I know it's still phenomenal, but it was definitely phenomenal when I was younger. And yeah, it makes a difference. And I just have to have a huge plug for all of us continuing to support with our tax dollars the library systems.
Awesome. Okay.
I'm curious about how you chose who was going to be a part of the book. I'm so fascinated with this process of like, how did you curate? Did you do a call for essays? How did you pick?
I love that you use the word curate, but it comes from the arts. That's how I feel. As we've gone through this process, I felt as though Jamie and I became like a guide, for humility, in a sense, like not sort of experts ourselves, but like from my art practice, I felt like it was sort of an act of curation. And then Jamie, I felt like, Jamie was sort of amazing because she's so good at looking across disciplines. So she would think like, who's must be really humble, ghostwriters, like, and she would come up with these terrific ideas about places that we could think. So, it started off with the four of us sitting down, Jamie and myself, and then Sarah Boss, who's a philosopher, and Erin Ahuvia from marketing, and just brainstorming. And, one of us, like Sarah, would say, my neighbor's a lawyer who ended up being Rick Boothman, who did this, and this sort of life change and that I just described, or, someone, so we just, and then one person led to another, and just kind of led from there. But it was also surprising what people, that we reached out to, what they chose to talk about. Like, it wasn't always what we thought they would. For example, Russ Belk, who also comes from consumer culture, he wrote about aging, which I hadn't anticipated. And I think it comes a little bit from him watching his mother, who was 97 at the time, watching the experiences she was going through. And like there's this love he has for her, which is like clear in the essay, and this admiration he has for her as someone who's really smart and funny. But by some of the staff at the facility where she lives, or the home where she lives, who have this kind of like sense of like elderly people being like childlike, or being not smart. And so he wrote this essay about the experience of aging as either one where you really have the capacity to kind of attain a natural humility, because you lose all of the sort of like props of status that, like your car or your job, that were sort of like forming your identity in slightly superficial ways. And so once you lose those, you really, there's a humility with their loss, but then, and also like understanding a kind of like stronger sense of identity that's behind all of those things. but then, in addition to that, there might be also humiliation with aging, is if people do treat you in these kind of like infantile ways. And he talks about the difference between them. So we weren't always sure what people would write about. It was sometimes a surprise to us in interesting ways.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think the last point about humility and humiliation, it kind of gets to like that not all communities have are sort of perceived by our culture equally. And so what it means to be humble for one group of people, like a white man, for example, is different than it is for like a member of the BIPOC community, for example. So, it was super important to us that voices, all sorts of voices were represented, both from like a disciplinary perspective and then from an identity perspective. So we did work hard to make sure that the colloquium initially and then the book had a lot of different voices in it. And there's a poem, there's one poem in the book, which is about how, like for a white man in particular, especially a white man at sort of the top of the status ladder, who had gone to like vaunted institutions and things like that, that adopting a posture of humility is very easy. And it almost like has no risks for him because people will be like, oh, congratulations, that's awesome. So like he can kind of like take a chip off his own shoulder, which other people have, like without asking for it, and then people are like, oh, you're like even better now. And so he, I think, had been living in a world in which that was happening to him. And it's kind of my perception that being invited to participate in our project helped him in some of the ways he was changing the way he was thinking about the work that he had done. I think he was sort of already at this inflection point. That's my perception. I don't know him super well. Having done a lot of work with underserved communities and the arts over time, he seemed to be like at this inflection point already. But then, in being pushed to kind of think about his contributions to like thinking about humility, he seemed to like really go to this very introspective place, which I think produce something that's really cool and a nice addition to the book to have. And the book in general has like a lot of variety in terms of like the style of writing and the people who are contributing to it.
Yeah, it really does. What else would you two like folks to know about the book or about your work in general?
Well, I think that the book is a really good starting point. So my hope is that people will, seek out the book in libraries potentially, or buy it. But that, I think that the essays in the book are not really meant to be like a roadmap. Like, I think what Jen Wright points out, that you go in and out of a state of humility, is like a very accurate takeaway. So I think that my hope is that people start thinking about humility, but not that they like make it the next sort of like juice cleanse. That like it's something that I think it's important to be mindful about, but that like something Jen Wright said, actually not in her essay but in a talk that she gave recently, is that we should seek to take up the space that we are owed as humans. So some of us need to take up more space actually, and some of us need to take up less. And I think that the book kind of, to me, the overarching feeling when you finish the book is that that's kind of a message that humility needs a place in our lives, but it's not like we should all kind of like hide from each other or not say when we have something that we're proud of. I think that's okay when it's time for that, but there are other times when it's time to let someone else have the spotlight.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things I've loved about kind of watching the book in the world is seeing how people respond to different essays in really different ways. I have one friend who started reading the book and would call me every night to tell me which essay they had read and what they thought of it. And, it was fascinating to watch the ones that they responded to, like Troy Jollymore's about education and, teaching, what it's like to teach young people, and sort of his hope for them that they can come to education with a sense of being open to what they don't know, and also being open to changing their mind about things. So this person really responded to that essay, and then also to the one about aging, especially. And I just have the sense of this book in a way that's changed for me since it's been published. I feel like it's a book that you could sort of keep rereading your whole life, and every time you read it, like a different essay would matter to you in a way that it maybe hadn't before, just because of like whatever you happen to be going through in your life at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I can see how that will happen with this book. So the last question that we always ask on the podcast is, how do you live a life of abundance? Rebekah, can we start with you?
Oh, that's such a fascinating question, and complicated. So we're going to need to edit out all of my like initial thought process. It might take me a minute to get there. Can I pause for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Abundance is a complicated word, because I think there's an inclination at first to think of it in terms of like a positive abundance, like happiness abundance. But I think a lot of the things that I've been reading or thinking over the last few years, are try to find meaning in all sorts of experiences, both positive and what we would have called, I guess, negative experiences. That there's meaning in trauma or tragedy or challenges. And I think that's really been true for my life as well, that all of the turning points and all of the moments where sort of like like the lights came on, or the sea parted and I could kind of see more clearly, came about because of instances that I wouldn't have necessarily wished upon myself, and I didn't really want to experience. So I really feel as though I define abundance in terms of kind of like a big complicated mess in a way, like that things can get very messy, but in the messiness of them and in those challenges, there is a clarity in terms of defining my own ethics and defining, for me, like how I understand other people and what they're willing to do in those situations. For me, I think the one thing thread through all of that is a kind of like honesty, of speaking my own truth, and being willing to like comment on what I'm seeing.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And Jamie, how about you?
So I think on my end, I think one of the takeaways from the book is, that it's okay to be ordinary, and like ordinariness is actually something kind of to strive for. So if you think about yourself as ordinary, then you're one of many. I think if we think about like trying to live our lives where we're just focused on ourselves and kind of like perfecting that's like, especially in the pandemic, that can feel super lonely. There's sort of like, I don't know, a natural like emptiness to that. But if instead you start to sort of shift your mind so that every person that you encounter has as big a life and a big an inner life as you do, like, so you go to the grocery store and every one of those people that you see, with their masks on and you're sort of avoiding each other, is their life is as big as yours. Like all of a sudden the world is just overflowing with like so much. There is so much if you sort of stop thinking about yourself, I think, which is hard to do. and there are times to think about yourself, but if we can kind of shift our perspective to like the smallness of ourselves and the bigness of others, I think like can really be almost like overwhelming with abundance, overflowing.
Thank you so much for sharing your truth today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.